Hi, everybody. So I'm Sarah Groff Palermo, Super SGP on Twitter, if you want to say nice things about me while I'm talking. This is the same talk that I did yesterday at Powered by JavaScript. They were really nice to ask me to come fill in for a last cancellation here at Strange Loop. So I'm really excited to get to share this with more people, but if you've seen it before, it's totally the same thing. So just a little bit about me to start. I'm a designer originally who basically taught myself to code because I wanted to make the weird things that I could imagine, and I didn't want to keep begging all of my dev friends to help me make it. So I just sort of figured it out piece by piece to do it myself. So I'm going to talk today about Art.js, which is not a library. I realized it sort of sounded like one after we came up with the title, but instead it's about the fine craft of making art with JavaScript and data, something I like to call data art. We're not going to talk a whole lot about code in this talk. There's not going to be any code samples up on the screen. Mostly, I think you're all smart people who like to figure things out. I'll talk a little bit about what each thing is made with, and a lot of it is D3, which there's a lot of really good resources for working with it. But instead, I want to talk to you about sort of the mechanisms of data art and why you should think about making it. And we'll look at some examples and some process, and hopefully by the end, you'll all be really excited and want to go out and make your own stuff and share it with all of us. That's my dream. So another quick note, which is about the word art. Sometimes the word art is a scary word. People like to argue about what's art and what's design and what's not art. And it's really fun to go to the bar and get drunk with your friends and argue about that. It's one of the perks of being an artist, and I highly recommend it. But today, I'm just going to take the broadest interpretation, which is to say that art is exploring things you like, experimenting, making something, and then calling it art. And that's all that it takes. And if somebody wants to argue with you, you can send them to me and I'll tell them, no, that's art. You made it, you said it's art, that's it. All right, caveats are done. So the next thing is to sort of define our terms. And a really important question is, what is data art and how does it relate to data visualization? How do we distinguish them? Is data art just pretty data visualization? It's not, they're different. But to talk about how they're different, I like to do things backwards. We're going to start with what they have in common. And what the two have in common is that they're both about the investigation of information. And they might be very different kinds of detectives. One might be more of a Sherlock and the other one might be, more of a Philip Marlowe, let's say. But in their heart, they're about investigating information. And they are structures that are set up around the kinds of information we classify as data, right? Which is to say, things that can be structured to be dealt with algorithmically, and that's really important. Sometimes when you make art, when you draw, when you paint, it's long and it's tedious and it's hard, but the really awesome part about making art with computers is you can make the computer do all the hard parts for you. So if that's how they're the same, let's talk about how they're different. There's sort of three basic methods that we can distinguish them along. The types of data each works with, their goals, and then therefore the types of expression used to achieve those goals. The first one, the kind of data, sort of goes on a spectrum from comprehensive on the one hand to fragmented on the other. Traditional data visualization, right, is organized around an ideal data set that's as comprehensive and unbiased as possible. And anybody who does data visualization will tell you that that never actually happens. That data set doesn't exist, but it's the dream, and people are working towards using that kinds of data, which is to say that, you're looking for these related quantifiable metrics that are all available, and then once you've pulled all of these little points together, you look and find the best patterns and the best stories that you can tell from that collection. And that's the dream of traditional data visualization. On the other hand, for data art, the ideal data set is small, fragmented, and incomplete. It's human and hopefully in some ways personal to you or to the kind of story that you want to tell. And these data sets are different, right? Because the goals of the work are different. Traditional data viz wants to communicate information. They want to tell you, what is known, or a way to say it is what they've found. On the other hand, data art is looking to communicate an experience, a thing we know through living, like a novel might. And you could say that they're looking to express what they've felt as opposed to what they've found. So this is a really important distinction. And when you have different goals, of course, you have different types of expression. And here's the first example we'll have. There's lots of examples in this. I have a big web page up that has all the links, so you guys can look them up later. But so this is the first, and this is an example of sort of like an ideal information communicating visualization from the New York Times. You know, you can see that it has a very high pixel to information density ratio. And, you know, while there's a story picked out here and little points called out for you to understand the information, you're also totally capable of accessing all of the precise points. You can see there in the gray that if you wanted to know why the line is where it is, how they averaged it out, you can sort of see how these are the means perfectly there and find each and every number. And that's a really great data visualization. On the other hand, here's a piece of data art. This is a work by Lori Frick called Nightly Sleep Analyzed. And you can see, so this implied x-axis here is the number of hours of sleep she's had, and the y-axis is sort of the months of the year. And each of the squares show travel and socialization. And it's less about sort of, you can look up how much sleep Lori Frick got on January 28th, and more the expression of the rhythm of her life, of her year, right? You can see that it gets really exciting towards the end of the year, the quiet at the beginning of the year, and while the while the fundamental underlying piece of it is data, that's not really what it's looking to express. And we'll find later in some of the examples that some data art doesn't even result in a visual result at all. It can be, words or something else, and that's great too, right? That the art is somehow the least visual of the kind of work you can do. Okay, so now that we know what data art is, you might say, why should we make it? I'm excited about it, but you don't have any reason to be, at least not yet. So, 4 reasons to undertake it. One is to understand ourselves. The second is to understand the systems to which we are subject and to which we subject others, right? We're social animals, and it's important to understand what kinds of things are happening, what the assumptions that we make. The third is to expand our horizons, datally speaking, so in terms of making data visualizations. And the fourth and most important reason to do this is because it's fun. And if it's not fun, then don't do it, Like, do other things that you think are fun, because we all go to work every day, and if you're gonna make cool stuff, you should do it because you love it. So let's talk a little bit about understanding ourselves. This is sort of where I start to talk about cliches, right? We live in a time of accelerating technical change, and as programmers, we ourselves are at the heart of it, which is awesome, but if our tools are changing quickly, as humans, we're probably changing less, and definitely less quickly than the possibilities we can imagine. But if the people who are shaping the interaction of technology are only those who are the most excited about it, we can end up with a sort of lopsided and constrained implementation that doesn't do justice to us. And that is a risk we run. Science and technology have their own biases, including assumptions about objectivity and what data means. And it's really hard to critique that within its own system. The way it talks about itself sort of precludes it. Which is to say something like, if you focus only on the kinds of truth that traditional data orbits around, then you start to think that that is the most important and the most true, and you can privilege the concerns of the engineers and people designing the system over the people using it, and we wouldn't want to do something like that. Meanwhile, humanities, particularly history and literature, sort of have as their project placing human activities into context and then systematically criticizing them in pursuit of understanding. And if they merely turn up their noses at tech, they're abandoning their missions. And I'm here today talking to you about this, but I also sometimes go and work with people who work in the digital humanities to get, English professors and history professors and other people using tech in their work as well. And I do that because together, I think they have superpowers. When we bring humanities and tech together, each makes up for the other's shortfalls and opens a window into who we were before the web and who will continue to be with it. And we can understand ourselves and make decisions that are good for today and good for tomorrow. And part of making good decisions is to understand the systems to which we subject ourselves and other people. And so originally, a long time ago, I studied in my degree is in literary theory. And literary theory really is about looking at these systems, and seeing how they're played out in our lives. And I love it, and it's great, and it's wonderful. And so I've always thought a little bit about this, but it started to seem more important to me. So this summer, I went to a conference called I/O, and it's basically a conference full of people who like to make data art and data visualization and all the kinds of stuff I enjoy. And one of the kinds of projects people make is something like Selfie City, which you can see here. And it uses metadata, both machine-made and human-generated. They used a lot of Mechanical Turk work to help classify photos, to sort of understand how humans differ from city to city, by gender, by age, when they're taking selfies, to understand something about us. So we're at this conference talking about all this kinds of work that we like to do. But this year was a little bit different, and people were a little on edge and a little defensive and a little bit sad. And that's because in between the conference before and the conference this summer, it turned out that someone else was all up in our metadata, right? All of a sudden, this thing that we had loved in like this little corner of the world being like, we just like to make data art with fun stuff, it was making people scared. People were like, I don't want my data out there. How are people going to use it? What are they going to do to me? You know? And they felt really threatened, and I think that that's important. And then again, right, we come home from the conference, and all of a sudden it turns out, there's the Facebook newsfeed experiment where researchers and data, and the company data scientists were changing people's news feeds, showing them only happy or only sad stuff to see if it affected how they felt. And some people argued, oh, Facebook already manipulates their news feed. It's fine. You shouldn't be upset. And you can sort of agree with that end or the other end. I mean, clearly Sheryl Sandberg doesn't give a shit. Like, she was manipulating her newsfeed. But it's clear that, right, both of these things made people feel super threatened. And, and I think because we like to make work with this kind of data, it was really hard for us to watch. But this is the cool thing. When we make art, we can take back those sorts of tools and use them to tell our stories and insert ourselves into it in a way that's our own tiny little way of pushing back against, people just using your data for things that you don't want them to. All right, that was a long one. The third one is to expand our horizons. And this is far more sort of practical and prosaic, right? When we make work with datavis, we want to communicate things and we want to pull people into these stories. And so you experiment with adding in some feeling or doing stuff like that, right? But sometimes it doesn't work out so great. This is a piece by Reuters that was showing, right, the gun death rate in Florida around the Stand Your Ground law. And sadly, because she was focused on actually communicating the information of, this blood dripping down in the sadness, but it actually shows the totally wrong story, right? It looks like it goes down when it goes up. And that's a big problem. So we want to make art so that we can start, playing around with things in a nice way that perhaps runs fewer risks. And a really good example of that is this work by Georgia Lupi and her studio Accurat. And what this is it's a visualization, actually, of auction prices for art to see if art is selling for a lot more than people expected. I think it's a really pretty bird flocking view, and it's really engaging. And that's something that you're looking for. When you want to tell people a story, you want to engage them. And so Lupi made this really artistic visualization, and she starts off by looking at actual art. That's this piece in the middle here is a modernist drawing, and she sketches them and copies over them and starts to think about how she can make something similar driven by data. So that's like a great reason to play with this. And reason number 4 is, like I said before, it's fun, and being fun is really important, not only for us, like I was talking about before, but it's important to make data something that's not just unfun. Sometimes a lot of quantified self stuff can be about scolding you. This is the happy fork. I like to call it the scoldy fork. What it does is it tracks how quickly you're eating your food, and if you're eating it too fast, it yells at you. And this is the kinds of things sometimes you see people make with data and the ability to make quantified self, that it's like, oh, we have these watches now and we can track every single thing we do, but like, if you're only using it to make yourself feel bad because you ate your cake too fast, like, is that really what we're looking for? So you should make fun stuff with it so that we don't just leave it in the realm of the unfun and the scoldy. All right, examples, even more examples. So the examples that I'm going to go through are sort of broken down into 2 wide groups. The literary approach, which I think of as, using data with the same sort of workings as we use books, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the second kind is sort of work where just language and literature are the data we're using to express our art. So there are two different approaches that I like, but there's great examples in both. So the literary approach. You remember a little bit before when I was talking about traditional data visualization, right? All these points wrapped together so we can find a pattern, and that tells us certain things, but it doesn't tell us very much about ourselves personally. I mean, if I look at an average of people like me, I don't see myself in it. I mean, I'm not average. Are you average? Probably not. But we can sort of approach it and find ourselves in data in a different way, and that's the literary way. And so if you think about it, right, literature and books, particularly fiction, they work by getting you to identify with characters who have absolutely nothing to do with you, right? I love to read mysteries about like a fat French policeman in the turn of the 20th century, and that he's nothing like me, but by creating this work of words on a page and expecting us to use our imagination and our empathy to bring this work to life, authors do a great job. They make us start understanding what it's like to be somebody other than us. And so there's data works too, where people, leave holes that you fill in with your knowledge with things other people know and really bring them to life. The first example I'm going to talk about is called First Chapters. There's actually two iterations of it. There was originally a manual version drawn out and done with Illustrator, and the data was all collected manually. And then there's a secondary version that somebody made with D3. So Stephanie Posavec, who made the original one, the way that First Chapters works is she's visualizing novel openings as connected sentences. The length of the line matches the length of the sentence, and they go around and around in a very pleasing layout until the end of the chapter is reached. And, it's the abstraction of an experience. The formal expression of the novel is expressed on the page. Hemingway is known for his brevity, but here we see his sentences are long and his chapters are short and airy. Meanwhile, here's 1984, all cluttered up on top of itself, sentence upon sentence piling up, becoming almost as claustrophobic and dystopian as the novel itself. Then, right, we have The Great Gatsby, which is an interesting interstitial. It has some dense points as, Nick's imagination wanders around, and some longer points connecting all of them. And it's lovely. Each of these is an expression of what it's like to read that novel, to experience its form. And you can project yourself in it, and it's really great. So she did this manually, and then by moving it into programming, by using D3 and making it interactive with JavaScript, right, we open up even another aspect to it, which is great. Jim Vallandigham is the one who did this, and you can start to even find mistakes in our own algorithms when you start visualizing them. Because I'm a jerk, I pulled out the mistake that I found. Which is that, a sentence is being counted incorrectly because I think he's using a period as a delimiter, and so, right, Mr. just flops that around. So, so we can make cool art, we can expand on it with our friends and find out neat stuff. The second example is A Day in the Life, which is about taxis, and this is all JavaScripted up. It uses the node package from Mapbox, it uses D3 on the front end for drawing, and then Leaflet for serving the map. And this is the map that we have. So basically, Chris Wong took taxi data from New York, and instead of sort of visualizing the averages of taxis and what they're doing, here he's just visualized, as you reload it, you can get a different taxi driver each time, but you can see the drivers driving around, picking up fares, dropping them off, and this is a very anecdotal story. You're seeing what it's like to be that taxi driver. And then, it's nice to have another little trap door in it. If you know New York, you can also start telling stories about the passengers. When I see somebody going up to the Upper East Side at 9 o'clock in the morning all the way over by the river, I know they're going to the hospital. And then you can start asking questions. Are they having a baby? Are they going to work? But there's this whole great story buried in it that draws you in. And we can start imagining what it's like to be all of these other people. The next one, hey, I made this mistake yesterday and I didn't fix it. So the next two things we're going to look at is quantified breakup and then frick bits. And they're interesting because they approach the same problem from two totally opposite sides. So quantified breakup, this is the piece where the data itself is the most personal. It covers the artist's divorce. So she starts making charts of, bubble charts of what she's bought to help her feel better, little line charts about the support of people who've called her and texted her over the time, these maps of cathartic subway ventures. And each chart together, right, works to crack open an aspect of her breakup and recovery that, just like words on a page, tell a full story by being pulled all together. And a totally different approach is FrickBits, which just had a very successful Kickstarter. It's the artist Lori Frick that I showed earlier. And it's pretty much the inverse. She's taking the most traditional location data, but making it more personal and approachable by rendering it to look hand-drawn and hand-painted. And this app, I think, should be out pretty soon. And so while they're both different, they're both rooted in using personalized data to take control, to, as Lori Frick says, make a tick mark in the column of I am not a data victim. And it shows a way to make some really exciting work. The last sort of literary approach piece is something that I've made, and this is called the timeline of neglect. And I don't know about you, but I buy books and then I just leave them on my shelf unread, and I feel really guilty about this. I get so excited when I see them at the bookstore and then I take them home and have to do other things. So what I've done here is I'm visualizing my books decaying over time as I leave them there. The line gets longer, it fades out, and so I'd like to actually make a hardware version of it where I can, just stick them on a little thing to see it fall apart. But yeah, so this is another right way that I'm trying to communicate this experience of something that I know is going on in our world that's sort of hard to see. And in each of these examples, data becomes not merely the aggregated numbers in whose patterns we seek to find ourselves, but instead becomes the stuff by which we express the specifics of who we are, whether, it's book guilt or divorce or we're a taxi driver. And we live in a time that speaks itself in data, so we're using the language of today to express today. There's also a really great opportunity, right? In discussing how genres are formed, Jonathan Culler, who's a literary theorist, he calls literature a paradoxical institution. It's an institution that lives by exposing and criticizing its own limits, by testing what will happen if one writes differently. What happens if we code differently? And we can make use of the questions that are very common questions that people ask when they're, analyzing literature. You can ask, who is speaking? Who's speaking what language and with what authority? And when you start to look at sort of, one step outside, then not only are you empathizing with people, but you're starting to see something else going on, to see how the outside world is working on what we do and what we say about what we do. And, as we interrogate all of these methods, we look for what underlies it. And, in the end, we turn out to reveal ourselves. All right, so now we're going to talk about language as data, which is a different approach. And in this approach, a lot of the works don't end up really being a visualization at the end, but are still, I think, fun, interesting works. So in Task of the Translator, which is another piece of literary theory that I was always a big fan of, Walter Benjamin talks a little bit about how impossible translation is, that meaning really adheres to an object in a cultural context. And a way to talk about that is to think that, if you're translating something from French into German, you can't really just say pain is brought, right? Bread is something different to a French person than to a German. Growing up in that culture, they mean something differently. And so when you start to translate things, what happens is you start to find a space where meanings don't adhere quite as tightly, and it tells you a little bit about both of those cultures coming into contrast. And we can do something sort of like this by playing with language and algorithmic structures. And to keep it from being boring, sometimes we make it pretty, and sometimes we make it absurd. So on the pretty end, this Patatap is a piece done by John O'Brien Lolotone, and they actually call it a sound animation kit. And if you go online and play with this, there's fun noises that go with it too. But part of the reason it's interesting to me is you type on your keyboard to create these visualizations, and then you hit the space bar to change the register. And it's a way to sort of understand how merely changing a register can take the same inputs and make them seem very different. And that's an abstract point, but I think it's important when we start to think about systems and interactions to, just see it distilled down into these colors. we can also sort of see in a different way some of the more absurd ways of combining pattern and language generation. And these are a patent generator and some Twitter bots. So Sam Levine created a patent generator. It creates patent applications out of literature using the pattern library, actually, and I know that someone's going to be talking about using that today, about looking at rap lyrics, so I'm really excited about that talk. But Sam Levine here has used it to combine works of literature and history with patent applications that sort of shows, you know, what are the assumptions we're making when we write patents? And these are the kinds of patents you would make for the Communist Manifesto. So the Communist Manifesto is, I can't read this here because that's over there. It's a system for generating, you know, revolutions and all sorts of exciting things. But it tells us something both about patents and, you know, about an interesting piece of literature. Likewise, there's node bots. These are two of my favorites. One of them is Two Headlines, which is by Darius Kazemi, who goes by Tiny Subversions. And the other is the Game Idea Machine, and I don't remember who it's by, and I keep forgetting to look it up. But in this case, right, they're both playing, again, with the structure of language and the assumptions we make. In Two Headlines, Darius Kazemi just switches out various nouns, and you can see that the structure of the headlines makes it make sense, perhaps in an absurd way, all at the same time. Likewise, with the Game Idea Machine, we see implications about how we think about making games. It's great because it almost becomes really repetitive, but in some ways, right, it might point to limitations in the way we conceive of the games that are popular to make now. And then the last example of structural work that's really interesting is less art than history. And this is work by the historian Matthew Connolly. And what he does is he uses data and the structure of data to look at redacted government documents and figure out where they should be making FOIA requests, what sorts of things they should be looking for, merely by the structure of what's missing. And I mean, I think that's beautiful, right? Like, it's history, but it's also art. Like, that by what's missing, you can start to find out what to explore. So those are all sorts of the different ways that you can work with language and literature and art and data and put it all up on the web using JavaScript. So now you're all really excited, right? You're ready to like totally leave and go make art right now. But you're like, oh, okay, I'm ready to go, but what am I gonna make? So I like to come up with topics in 3 different ways that might be sort of ways to start turning over what you know. You can start with topics, you can start with tools, and you can start with translation. So with topics, you might ask yourself questions about, you know, what do you love that has nothing to do with tech? What sort of fuzzy, strange thing can you drag into this world of rules and make crazy stuff with? Also, you know, what system has assumptions you want to explore? What do you want to go poke at? What dark spots do you want to shine light on? And you know you have the right thing when you can't stop talking about it at all. Sometimes that doesn't work, though, and then you say, okay, but maybe there's tools that I want to play with. On the D3 website, there's a huge gallery full of beautiful layouts and visualizations, and I've definitely made stuff by saying, I want to figure out how to make, you know, a sunburst tree map. Where can I find data that's the right kind of data to mess around with this? Likewise, some really fun node stuff. There's also this pattern library that I mentioned before, and then Topo Time, which I still haven't figured out what I want to do with, but is really exciting to me. It's a way about structuring data about time when you don't have precise time data. If you can say, I know that this happened before this, and after this, or you can say something like, the first 10 summers of my life, X happened. That's the kind of data that you can put into Topo Time, which is built on top of D3 by Elijah Meeks, who actually, I think he has a book downstairs about D3 at the Manning table, but right, you can start playing with this, and that might be a really fun tool to make work with. The third way is what I like to call translation, right? Can you remake something that you think is beautiful, driven by data? These are just silver prints. It's metal foil inside wax. I think they're super lovely, and you know, I start to wonder what kind of data could I use? What could I do to come out with something that looks a little bit like this? All right, so we know we want to make stuff. We have an idea. What do you do? What kind of process? This is going to be a little bit of a fast one because you guys all write code, which means you all already know everything about the creative process. This is just this is just a little bit more fun because now you don't have to justify what you're doing to like your project managers or your clients or anyone else, but it's the same sort of thing, right? So I like to start with sketching. This is that piece again that Georgia Lupi really liked. And so you can start by copying art you like just to get a feel for it, to get yourself going. Or, you can sketch what you want to make. It's a really good way to iterate through ideas, right? You can always throw away the pieces of paper when you don't like what you drew on them. And then once you know what you want to make, you can gather your data. And remember, this part does not have to be perfect. All of the book work I've done is literally just me sitting in my house entering like data about my books into a CSV. Like that's it. And you want it to have holes and be a little rough because, right, that's the whole fun of this part. So then you have all your data together. And then you're going to test it out, you're going to fail, and you're going to try again. And it's going to go over and over and over again. This doodle was made by a woman named Jo Bradshaw to illustrate a tweet by Marcus Romer about the creative process, right, how you feel. And it starts with, this is awesome. Then this is tricky. This is shit. I am shit. This might be okay. And finally, back to this is awesome. And it will happen, right? And it's worth sticking it out. And there's lots of really good ways to stick it out. And sometimes what you get is nothing like what you wanted in the first place. So this is another thing I made, Dot. It's also about my books. I like to make things about my books. But you can see on the left, that first sketch is absolutely nothing like the second piece that's come up that also has sound. But by, hitting my head against a wall over and over and over again, I ended up making something that I think is wonderful. And like I said before, there's a lot of really great D3 resources. I have even more up on my website. But, interactive data visualization is by Scott Murray, and then D3JS in Action by Elijah Meeks. These two books I think are great. The Scott Murray one is a little bit more, I've never done D3 before. It can be finicky, so it's sort of worth, taking a look at how it's weird. And then D3JS in Action is a little bit more intermediate. There's some great people, too, who blog about it, including Irene Rose and Shirley Wu. And then if you're in San Francisco, there is the Gray Area Foundation for the Arts, which I think is amazing. They just got a huge theater on Mission Street, and now they're, doing creative coding classes and immersives, and they have meetups and all sorts of different art shows and stuff. And I think that if this is the kind of stuff that excites you, I've pretty much never gone to a meetup with them that I didn't leave wanting to do 500 other things. They're great. So then that's, the last step is just to share, make it work, show it to other people, see what happens. It has to start off being for you. So if you keep exploring, eventually you will find your audience. I think there's a writer, Austin Kleon, right, who's like, just keep putting it up and keep doing the things you believe in, and the people who also believe in that will find you as long as you do it and share it. So, that's it. Ask questions, poke at stuff. Make your computer do all of the hard work for you. Express your incomplete truths, share it eventually. And, if you keep doing that, then your understanding and mine will grow, and we can make some really, really awesome stuff. So thank you guys so much. We have a couple minutes left if people have questions. Yeah.
So how do I balance that with my users? Like, how do I, are there strategies for meeting, users that have different capability well? How do I balance datavis and data art?
So the question, just to repeat, is how do you balance sort of data visualization and data art? If you're working in data visualization and you find that, some amount of arting it up brings users in, but a lot of times people who are working with data very much come from a statistics background who like to have all the information. What do you do? What are your strategies for finding the balance? I think there's a couple of interesting ways people have approached it. I think the New York Times does a great job of basically walking people through a data set and then at the end having a sandbox that everyone can play with. They recently did something about incomes for various incomes going up and down across a whole bunch of different categories of working groups. And, when you first look at it, it's this like overwhelming line chart, but you scroll through and it calls things out. And then at the end, it has them all broken out and you can play with it. I think that's a really big step. I think something else that helps too is remembering that people who aren't sort of drawn in, the question isn't showing people everything and showing them a little bit. Sometimes the question is getting people to understand a little bit and getting people to close the browser window and go somewhere else because it's just too much. So less than sort of like betraying your mission, you can think of it, I think, as a step series of groups that you bring people in and they get excited and they get excited, and then some of those people eventually will be more like you and want to like dig into all of the deep stuff, but it's a process, I think. Anyone else? Awesome, I'm happy I answered all of your questions with these slides. So thank you guys so much. You can find me online. You can find links to the things that we make if you follow me. I will be making more posts about all the weird stuff I make in C, and I hope you'll share something you make with me too. So thanks so much, guys.